I'm Manouk Akopyan. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you to our partners, personal injury attorney Nelson Gevorkyan. Hi, everyone. I am joined by Marty Corwin, who is getting ready to unveil his new book, Arum Don King, 6 Decades of Boxing Gold. Marty, this is an amazing opportunity for you because you come from a unique position, having worked with two of the greatest boxing promoters of all time, their head of production. You're currently the head of production for Bob Arum in Top Rank, and the book is just filled with so many amazing anecdotes and information over the last few decades of boxing. But before we get into all of the nitty gritty, why was it important for you to get this book out?
I started out on this project putting down some of the stories of some of the things that have happened to me in the last, 40 years, uh, before I forgot them was my initial motivation. And then, I am the only person who's ever been a department head for Bob Arum and Don King. So it kind of was a logical thing for me to write about these two guys. And I truly admire their accomplishments, which is the focus of the book for me. I think being a promoter is one of the hardest jobs imaginable. And I think these two guys have done an amazing job. Don King for a couple of decades and Bob Arum for 6 decades. I don't think there's ever going to be another Don King or Bob Arum. And I really admire their accomplishments.
And the book just goes through just a collection of amusing stories that you've gotten to be a part of. I'm sure those are going to be very interesting to boxing fans. It offers a behind the scenes glimpse into sports TV. As a first time author, how was it just putting this entire thing on paper?
It surprised me at how much of it just kind of flowed when I got started. The idea, like I say, was to put the stories down before I forgot them. And when I kind of outlined what stories I wanted to talk about, it just kind of came back. It was like the memories, came back and putting it out there. I did a lot of research into, times and dates for Bob's greatest fights and for Don's greatest fights. So there's different things in this book for different people. If you're a boxing purist, then you can go back and relive some of those amazing fights these two put on: the Rumble in the Jungle, the Thrill in Manila, the Leonard Duran series. A lot of the great fights are recounted here. There are things people might not remember, like that Muhammad Ali was going to fight Wilt Chamberlain, and that Bob Arum was putting it together, and Customato was going to train Wilt Chamberlain, and then it went awry when Muhammad Ali made fun of Wilt when they showed up for the press conference, and Wilt said, "I'm out of here." Things like that people may not know. People might not remember that Bob Arum was the promoter for Evel Knievel's Snake River Jump, or that Don King was the promoter for the Jackson family's victory tour. So there's things you might not know. And like you said, there's other stuff about my career behind the scenes, television production, and how that's changed in 40 years, and traveling around the world with my friend the Colonel for these two guys. There are some stories. That's what the promoter liked. They said, we don't necessarily do that many boxing books anymore, but this one's different because it's from the perspective of a television producer.
Absolutely. And before you made your bread and butter in boxing, you were involved in all kinds of major sports for over 10 years, working at Viacom for the Washington Bullets, the Washington Capitals, Baltimore Orioles. So, you're
Right.
a sports guy through and through. And when you were putting this book together, did you actually interview Bob and Don King to get some certain stuff straight, to add some more color to some of the stories, or is this all based off of your memory and accounts?
It's as factual as I can remember. If there's any lapse, it's just in my memory. But no, there's no, you know, escalation. No. These are things that actually happened. There's a story in there about a brawl that happened at the Britannia Hotel after a Don King event with Boom Boom Johnson, and it is the facts that actually everything in this book actually happened to the very best of my recollection.
for fans of a certain age, they might not remember the days when Don and Bob were at each other's necks and just true rivals. How does
Right.
the book also cover their relationship they had with one another throughout the last 6 decades?
Both of these men said the same thing in a different way. That, yeah, they weren't friends, they were real rivals. But if the deal made sense, they could work together. They worked together. I mean, I worked with the two of them in 2010 on a fight when Don King had Mayorga and Bob Arum had Cotto. And these two guys came together. And I even put the two of them sitting next to each other to do a side by side interview. So when it was, a good business proposition, they could work together, and they did that through the years. They worked together really on the Rumble in the Jungle and on fights in Vegas. Um, so it happened, and it was just a business thing. At the end, Bob Arum had a very a lot of good things to say about Don's abilities to do what he did. And he said, in the end, I acknowledge he really succeeded in his own way.
And for those who might not be aware, how did you transition from the major sports into boxing? What was kind of your entry into the sport?
It was a really funny story, which I put in the book, and it's too long for me to really recount here. But basically, I was doing 110 games a year for Viacom, the Washington Bullets basketball, Caps hockey, and Orioles baseball. And I got a call out of the blue from somebody who called themselves TVP out of Florida. They said, we need somebody to do what you do, a producer, director, production manager who can wear a lot of hats and do live sports production, and you'll be the head of the department. And they went on and on about this, turns out, fictitious company. They didn't tell me it was Don King. They didn't tell me it was boxing. And I went for an interview because I said, oh, I got to find out, who these people are. Because I kind of had the sense that Bullets were not going to continue on Viacom past the next season. So I said, let me go listen to these people. And after 5 interviews, I said, well, thank you very much. Very interesting. And I wanted to meet Don King, and I met him. And Don charmed me on that 5th interview, flattering me. I didn't realize it was a sales pitch at that point. And he said, we got to get you in here, brother, man. Like what you do. And he asked me, he said, what's it going to take to get you in here? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I don't know what you make. I said, oh, you mean salary? And I threw out what I thought was a kind of a crazy number because I really had no intention of working for Don. And he shook my hand. He walked out. He said on his way out the door, he said, well, make sure Marty's on the plane tomorrow. I said, what do you mean? No, I have a flight later tonight. And the manager of pay-per-view there, Jim Marilla, said, no, man, he asked you for a number. You gave him a number. He shook your hand. You work here now. So
That's
that's how I
terrific.
made the transition.
What year was that?
1993. And I've been in boxing ever since. I was with Don for about 8 years. And then I did one fight for Top Rank because they had an emergency. A director, the week of the fight, had to bow out. And my friend, who was the producer for Top Rank, asked me if I'd fill in as a director on the show. It was Oscar De La Hoya and Ike Corte in February of '99. And I said, well, I'll help you out if nobody finds out I'm doing it, because of course, Don wouldn't like me doing a Top Rank fight. So I did that fight, and somebody from Don King Productions found out. Basically, Don fired me. And Top Rank said, well, okay, then you'll do all our shows. And I've been doing them for the last 26 years.
And you're still with Top Rank now. Let's talk about the current picture because I know you talk about the entire business of boxing in the book too. We all know Top Rank is with ESPN. There's reports out there that the deal is expiring and there might be a new home for Top Rank. How has the evolution of TV, a boxing on TV, been for you? And what are some of the proud wins that you've had throughout the years?
It's changed tremendously. And that's one of the things in this book that you probably don't see in a typical boxing book. I talk about the 40 plus years of changes in sports production. going back to my day, when we had 2-inch video and the production equipment that was involved. When I started in boxing, Bob Don King was with Showtime. And HBO had kind of given Don a take it or leave it deal. He said no thanks, and he went to Showtime. Tony Cox hooked him up, and within a few years, Showtime had the top 3 pay-per-views of all time, all Mike Tyson. So starting there, I spent 10 years or so with Showtime, and then with Bob Arum, we were with HBO, 17 years with HBO, who were also amazing at their production, and now for the last 7 or so years with ESPN. And yes, the ESPN deal, I guess, goes through July, and we don't know if it'll be extended. I certainly am not on that end of the business and can't speak to that, but we'll see. But the evolution went from broadcast networks to the over-the-top networks, streaming, and the DAZNs of the world and the other streaming networks, Paramount and ESPN Plus and all that. It's been a tremendous change. HBO gets out of boxing, and now Showtime gets out of boxing. We don't know what's going to happen down the road, but certainly the consumers win in that there is more boxing on television than there's ever been. I don't understand when people say boxing is dead. There's more boxing on television than there's ever been, and it goes for the promoter direct to the consumer. So, that's kind of good for everybody in one sense.
And we see where promoters, if they choose, they're live streaming on YouTube. They're essentially giving the content for free at that point, and building the audience, building the fan bases. But as far as building fans, there was no one better than King and Arum. And just going back to them, what was Don King like off camera? Because he's obviously a character when the lights are on, but what was he like behind the scenes?
Don King is probably the smartest man I've ever met. It amazed me when I met him and started working with him to see he was nothing like what I expected. He worked around the clock, the amazing number of hours he put in every day. He took no days off, no holidays. He just worked all the time. And he expected the guys who worked for him to kind of keep up with him. It was just amazing. He once said that, he's a success because he hasn't taken a day off since he left prison. And it's kind of close to true. Bob Arum's the same way. Bob works all the time, even into their 90s, and they're both 92 now, Don and Bob. They're about 5 months apart. They work unbelievable hours. And it's just remarkable to me. People have no idea how difficult it is to be a promoter. And I talk about that in the book. I think being a promoter is one of the hardest jobs there is. And these two guys, there's never going to be another Bob Arum. So, the work ethic for me was the most surprising and amazing thing to watch. So my idea with this book was, I know the controversies people talk about with both of these guys, but my focus is really on their accomplishments, which I think are remarkable and deserve praise.
Well, I mean, we see Bob at the events. First fight, he's already sitting front row, Derek next to him. They're pretty much the only two guys on the screen when you see them on TV. What do you make of just Bob's commitment at this stage and age of his career? He's obviously tremendously more active than Don, who only does a handful of shows a year, mostly in the Florida market. But how would you describe just Bob's vigor at this stage of his life?
He's still in the office almost every day. It's still amazing, to me, what he puts in. But Bob also has a great team around him. And, the biggest difference, people always ask me, what's the difference between Don and Bob? The biggest difference is that Don King used to handle everything himself. He took care of pretty much everything. Bob Arum, by contrast, has some really good people who he's given authority to and given the authority to do what they do. The Carl Morettis in boxing and the Brad Jacobs in production and the matchmakers, Bruce Trampler and Brad Goodman. These guys do their job and they know Bob's got their back. And most importantly, Bob handed the reins to Todd DeBuff, who has done an amazing job himself as a boxing businessman to bring the company forward. In the very beginning of the social media startup, Todd DeBuff understood what that was going to mean for the future. And I think Top Rank is one of the very best at utilizing social media the way they do. And that's thanks to Todd. Todd, putting together the ESPN deal. So Bob has given people the authority to take the company forward. And that's the big difference.
Do you think that's also the reason why, Don perhaps hasn't evolved over the last couple decades, where it's obviously he is a shell of his former self as far as the boxing goes?
I don't really have as much contact with Don anymore, so I can't really say his motivation or things like that, and I don't pretend to know, but it's the way it seems to me also.
What would you make of the '90s when you first jumped on board? You obviously came in at a crazy time. Mike Tyson is making his return. You're involved in those big fights in that era. What was life like for you, just being involved, Don and Mike, and putting on those events with your good friend Colonel Bob Sheridan as well?
I was absolutely spinning in circles, wondering how did I get here? I literally, like I said, I didn't know I even got hired when I got hired. And I wound up the next day standing in the center of the dirt floor bull ring in Mexico City, preparing for a fight. I'm like, I just left NBA arenas that were nice and clean and easy to work in. And now I'm here in a bull ring in Mexico City, the Plaza de Toros. Like, how did I get here? And in the beginning, and this is something the colonel said to me, he says, Marty, you have no idea. You're starting here. It's like being a baseball director, and your first game is in the World Series. Because I was doing Julio Cesar Chavez pay-per-views and then Tyson. A few weeks after starting with Don, he had me go into prison to meet Mike Tyson with a camera crew from Canal Plus France to do an interview. I'm like, this is, stranger than fiction. So I started out literally at the top level of boxing, doing those pay-per-views for those guys, and shortly thereafter doing the Tyson pay-per-views. And Tyson McNeely was massive. I had 14 or more trucks in the TV compound doing production for Japan and for France and for Germany, because part of my job doing the world feed was taking care of the foreign broadcasters. It was like a mini Super Bowl. So go in, get into the water with both feet. I literally was into my neck in week 2.
What was the first fight? What was that one with Don King?
The first fight I did for Don was Carbajal Gonzalez in the bull ring, and I was at a Chavez fight before that, Chavez Taylor 2, I think it was September 14th or 17th, 1993, at the MGM. But then my first event was the Carbajal Gonzalez fight in the bull ring in Mexico City, which was just an amazing event. There was, a lot of things going on in that event. That was the first of the trilogy for Luis Santana and Terry Norris. I don't know if you remember that, where Terry Norris got disqualified twice, lost his belt. Luis Santana goes out of the ring on a stretcher twice with the belt on top of him. Amazing. So that was the first event. And from there, I went right to Quito, Ecuador, where we did the Bernard Hopkins Segundo Mercado fight, which I fed to Showtime because they didn't go to Ecuador. And so right out of the bat, I was producing the entire show, which was on Showtime down in Quito, Ecuador. And that fight, great story in the book, almost didn't happen because the Ecuadorian customs couldn't get our equipment through until my good friend Pancho Limon got it through. And I'll let people read that in the book because it's a great story. But that fight almost didn't happen.
So you go from Cal Ripken Jr. to George Mirasan to all of a sudden covering the characters of boxing. How was that culture shock for you too?
From Manute Bol to Mike Tyson. Yeah, that was a bit of a culture shock because I knew basketball a lot better than I knew boxing. I was pretty new to boxing. So I literally had to study because I wasn't a boxing guy growing up. I literally had to study because part of my job was also being a producer. So I had to learn what every other boxing fan already knew. So it was a big culture shock. But I learned immediately on that boxers were not like other athletes. I have tremendous admiration for boxers because they really have to embrace the gladiatorial spirit. And what I mean by that is when they get into the ring, they know win or lose, this could be the fight that ends their career. They could get hurt permanently, and they have to put that fear out of their heads in order to perform. A football player knows they might get hurt, but they don't expect to get hurt. But a boxer, even if they win, takes shots to the head that could, cause them permanent. So that's a gladiatorial spirit I don't see in other athletes. So I acknowledge that early on. So I think it's very different. But yes, it really was a culture shock. But I like boxers a lot. They also don't have a league, so they have to support themselves. I have great admiration for boxers.
And of course, you get thrown right into the thick of things with Mike Tyson. With doing TV myself, I always look forward to the production meetings on fight week when the fighters come through, and it's just you and the fighter and the entire team that's about to put on the show. What
Right.
was Tyson like behind closed doors during those production meetings when he was going up against McNeely and Selden, Bruno, Holyfield, you name it?
Mike and I got along with Mike right away, and I had a tremendous admiration for him early on. I was really surprised by Mike the first time I met him, and as I said, that was in prison. I brought the camera crew from Canal Plus into the Indiana prison to meet him, and he had asked for and received a book on French architecture, and he talked to Charles Bietri from Canal Plus. I couldn't believe the things they were talking about. Mike really was a much more intelligent person than I realized, had interests that really surprised me. Mike is a tremendous historian also. Mike is one of the best boxing historians I've ever met. So I had a real admiration for Mike early on, and we got along fine. I mean, I'm not pretending we were friends, but when I worked with him, we got along just fine. And I really came to admire Mike early on for his talents. I think he had a lot to contend with, uh, in dealing with the public. So, I kind of give him a little leeway for that. But no, I great admiration for Mike and one of the greatest, right hands ever.
Absolutely. And you have covered essentially everyone under the sun over the last 30 plus years and
Right.
taking us all the way through Manny Pacquiao and Floyd Mayweather, and the list goes on and on. Who was your favorite fighter to, uh, I wouldn't say cover, but to produce and showcase?
uh, you know, Different fighters for different reasons, had were on the tops of my list. But for me, number one was Manny Pacquiao, because being a world champion in 8 weight categories. If you ask a fighter what's the most impressive thing, that's got to be it. With other fighters, there's other fighters who have 5 categories, but for him to go as a champion in 8 weight categories, that's got to be the most impressive thing a fighter can accomplish. I mean, Floyd Mayweather was a great fighter, and I give him the greatest credit for being the smartest businessman ever to wear trunks to make, the purses he made. But Manny Pacquiao to me was my favorite because of his boxing accomplishments and the kind of person he is, building hospitals and schools and taking care of people back in General Santos City in the Philippines. So I've huge Manny Pacquiao fan.
And again, all of this covered in the book, Arum and King. I can't wait to really dive into it myself. Marty, any last words to everyone listening in right now and watching? What can they expect from the book, and what do you hope they get out of it?
I think there's a little bit for everybody in there. Like I say, the big, the diehard boxing fans will read some things about the early fights that they may not remember. There's things about Bob and Don they may not have known before, like Bob Arum's very first promotion in 1966, Muhammad Ali against George Chuvalo in Toronto. Bob Arum says that was his hardest event ever. His number one, 10,000 fights later, his very first fight was his hardest promotion. That's an interesting story in itself. And then there's the television stuff. And I hope, the stories about me traveling are amusing, but there's a little something for everybody. And that's what I hope people enjoy.